When I got my first CNC router, I had great expectations and a certain amount of trepidation. I was aware of a big learning curve ahead before possibly being able to generate any income or return from the investment of time yet to be forfeited and money. As I previously explained, I settled on primarily using 3mm end mills, as although slow, they catered for my needs. With the lathe as an example of a hand-controlled machine, when it comes to speeds and feeds, I will cut at a speed much slower than what a tool or the material is capable of. What is important to me is my reaction time while watching numbers reduce on the DRO. For me, this requires quite a lot of focus and concentration. A thought could strike at any time, and while vaguely conscious of flickering lights ahead, I'm away with the fairies, visualizing some mechanism or gadget or mentally adding some lines of code to some software or who knows what. With some tasks, focus is important. With others, it's a chance to tidy loose ends, review, and get a fresh perspective without the trees in your way. The router, being a tireless wonder boy, as long as it is fed electricity, was going to chew through metal like a mad dog. It's bad enough having to draw the component for it, work out a cutting profile and sequence, ensuring the bit doesn't foul on any parts it removes, telling it correct speeds, feeds, and cutting depths, setting up its positioning, and having to secure the stock in it, check its mister is working and that it has water and its compressor is on. But for it to expect me to be its unpaid babysitter or feeder as it chews metal faster than I can settle into my work, which has already fallen behind from satisfying its cravings. Who's the master and who's the slave? No way am I going to give it a name. It's just a bloody machine. Working with metal and other materials is touchy-feely. If you are drilling holes on a drill press, or even with a hand-held drill, you will alter the pressure to compensate for the malleability of the material being drilled, ensuring that you are cutting rather than burnishing and not exceeding the power factor of the tool to hand. All processed materials, although they may be regarded as a similar type, notwithstanding that they may also change with time, have subtle differences to their properties that a craftsman or woman's hands can compensate for, often without consideration. My CNC machines do not possess this skill. When I first used this machine, I thought depth of cut, circa 2/5 of the cutter's diameter, alter the spindle, speed, feed rate for the number of flutes, 2 or 3, to ensure it was cutting a little from each flute. I would tweak these values as I got feedback from watching each job being cut. It was always anxious, and getting a finished product was a success. I was not saving time, but the machine could add fancy curves that would not be practical for me to do. I would reread sections of the manual, alter machining parameters after jobs, hoping for a more controllable machine. Print and stick up drawings of parts with their cutting profile number, making them easy to find and replicate. I also had to wear ear protection when using this machine, as it was very loud when cutting. Unbeknownst to me, if I altered and saved a machine parameter while the job was loaded, it only applied to that particular job, and the X, Y, and Z positions for that job were also written in stone. If I reset X, Y, and Z for a new piece of work and reloaded that job, they would revert and sometimes break the tool. With the investment of time in each component produced by this machine, and often this would be only just one of hundreds of components needed for a project, it is somewhat understandable and yet incredulous that I had this machine for 2 years before I discovered that all the G-code, speeds and feeds were being ignored, as, by default, there is a tick box set to do this. Maybe with the noise, the earmuffs, and the stress, I assumed for all that time that
time passes quickly down there in the valley.
By this stage, I had reduced the depth of cut to 0.33 millimeters, as the 1.2 millimeter needle splinters were sticking in the skin of my fingers and could be quite sore. I could set and save the machine's parameters when there was no job loaded. I could now set the speeds and feeds in G-code, and the machine would recognize them. The spindle speed is set with a knob on the router spindle. I set the standard G-code plunge feed rate into metal at 1 millimeter a second, and when plunging into air at the edge of the work at 6 millimeters per second. I would use 1.1 millimeter a second and 6.1 millimeter a second instead if I wanted markers to search for, should I wish to alter the code prior to cutting the part. The spindle is a brushed motor with air vents in the side of it. If you look at it running in the dark, you can see sparking on the commuter when it is under load. I determined the speed to run it at by a combination of sound and minimum sparking when plunging into work, ensuring maximum brush life, circa 1 year typically for me. The feed rate I run at is typically 5 millimeters per second for aluminium and 12 millimeters per second for polycarbonate. A 4 millimeter hole I would cut at 3.6 millimeters per second, a 5 millimeter at 4.2, and a 6 millimeter hole at 4.6 millimeters per second. One day, arriving into work early, the machine had been busy all the previous day and was still wet. I set up to cut more parts. I had an itchy eyelid and I just had to rub it. I wiped my wet fingers with a tissue to hand, but there was some swarf on it. I wiped my hands on my trouser leg, but there was also swarf on that. I rubbed my eyelid with the knuckle of my least contaminated finger. Eyelid skin is quite delicate. I ended up with 3 blisters on my eyelid, which lasted a few weeks. It can be very difficult to get an MRI scan above the waist if they suspect you could have a slither of metal in your eye. I was told that the magnetic resonance could cause it to behave like a mini whisk and scramble your eye. When I was young and somewhat less assertive, I was asked to cut some stainless steel. I should have explained that although I had an angle grinder with me, I didn't have eye protection or a plastic bottle that I could cut open and tape to my head, as I had done on occasion. With some people, any excuse is just an excuse. They can badmouth and retaliate so fast, but they refuse to listen to technicalities or reasons why you will not do as they ask. Anyway, I did as they asked, taking all the care I could, but a month afterwards, I woke one morning with excruciating pain in one eye. I ended up in a hospital where a doctor had my eye under a powerful microscope. He made a makeshift tweezers from 2 syringe needles and picked a stainless steel shard from it. For the routers now, my depth of cut for aluminium is 0.18 millimeters as standard, and for holes between 3.2 millimeters and 5 millimeter diameter, I will plunge 0.15 millimeters into the work. The idea is to make a dust that does not cause me any harm. There is so much of it around my workshop. With polycarbonate, I will cut between 0.6 to 0.9 of a millimeter, usually 0.9. When the router is performing interpolation, with more than one axis moving at a time, apart from straight lines with, say, a 3:4 or a 5:12 ratio, then there will be calculating involved, where the lesser number has a number of decimal places, as dictated by the software/hardware. These floating point values need to be rounded up or down to the nearest whole number. If the cutter moves in the opposite direction, the same rules probably apply rather than the inverse. What I am trying to say is, as a cutting tool works its way around the profile of any but the very simplest of shapes, there are induced and inevitable errors in its final position. If I am performing a profile cut around a shape on a piece of metal 12.8 millimeters thick, I would cut to 13.6 millimeters usually. Divide that by 0.18 millimeters per plunge, so I would circumvent the part 76 times. The machine knows exactly where it is at all times. G-code gives 76 sets of clear instructions, absolute coordinates to move to. These are noted and only used as new values to continue calculating its interpolation. Only if the cutting tool is lifted, even a tiny amount, will the machine break from calculating, reassert its true position, and begin a fresh new calculated movement, breaking free from relative values. Parts can end up with one side vertical, where the side of the tool takes an extra shave off the work with each pass. The opposite side of the work can be sloped, where the cutter is moving further away with each drop in height. For any profile cuts, where accuracy is important, I will plunge with a feed rate of 1.1 millimeter. Then I can search through the code with a text editor for F1.1 and add a line of code above it, G00, and then a Z with a value greater than the current Z. If there are tabs on the job, they create a lift too, and on their own can hide some of the previously formed slopiness. I will also search for F6.1 and replace it with F1.2. This is where I come in from the edge of the job and I am using tabs, but don't want to plunge fast after each tab. If and when I get a chance, I will refresh my Visual Basic, it's been a while, and write a post-processor to automate this and other post-processing tasks. Well, that's the story of how the elusive Mr. X and Y were foiled by our hero, Mr. Z. Dan dang. Dan da dang dang.
As we jump from the frying pan right into the fire, leaping as the oil burns, the flames are reaching higher. Who's here to save us from our own funeral pyre? Attacks and funding may be their foremost desire. Step 1, Step 2, get with the program. We must dance to the algorithm while we are doing the carbon footprint, stepping the carbon footprint. We should be, we could be. Can't you see? Dance with me. Walking the carbon footprint, dancing the carbon footprint. We must be, we could be, talking the carbon footprint.
With a little bit of funding, maybe I can turn that into a proper little ditty. Or if I put the words in the blurb underneath, maybe someone may care to add a verse or change it, and it could grow organically. George Orwell would have said that freedom would entitle anyone to say what they thought or felt, even if others disagreed or felt different. In a world where people will vehemently and aggressively argue for whoever pays them, truth and freedom are obsolescent words of despicable fools. Orwell would also have said that one shouldn't criticize unless they are willing to consider and offer a solution or fix. There are alternative ways to harness energy and to reduce the percentage of carbon in the atmosphere, should nature not be capable of reaching equilibrium. But fighting tribes, hidden agendas, and scaring children is more in keeping with our crazy world. Anyway, I am done with the techie, heady, recce stuff for this episode, so on with the verbal diatribe. So how did we get to here?
Let's go back to your childhood.
When I was small, virtually all the schools in the country were run by Catholic religious brothers and nuns who were contracted and funded by the state to educate the country's children. These nuns and brothers were part of religious groupings or sects who lived in celibate communities. They would take vows of some sort and would dress in brown or black uniforms called habits. I don't know where these people came from or where they went, but they were a common sight throughout the land. Families were large. It was traditional that the family farm went to the eldest son. The second eldest became a priest. State, bank jobs, and council jobs were commonly filled through nepotism. It was par for the course, to use a golfing term. Even today, capability and education may get you subordinate to a boss lesser educated and with lesser intellectual capacity, but with the connections to have their card marked. There was a time when card cheats were expelled from a gentleman's club, but the times they have changed. I was born at Christmas, and kids could not go to school until they were 4 years old and toilet trained. So I was to start my schooling after Christmas, aged 4, missing out on the first semester. Before the first term ended, after class one day, I was brought by my mother to the classroom, low babies, to be introduced to my new teacher. He was a jolly, friendly man, wearing a robe. He was also the headmaster of the school. There were printed, brightly coloured drawings of letters, numbers, fruit and animals on the walls, and the impression was of a happy, child-friendly classroom. I was quite carefree and had no great expectations or trepidations of what was ahead of me. Parents and adults were hyping it into a big deal, but I was just going to wait and see. Christmas came and went, and my first day of school came. Both my mother and elder brother were with me in the bus from a fork in the road about a mile's walk from our home. My mother did not drive at that time, and we had only one car, which was normal for the times. I was left at the school gate. My brother disappeared somewhere. My mother had to make her way home to whoever was minding my 2 younger siblings. I was left holding a kiddie-sized suitcase with my sandwiches, a small flask of drinking chocolate, a pencil case and a copybook. The schoolyard was full of noise and chatter from the hordes of schoolboys, none of whom I knew. Presently, a brother came to the front door steps of the school and started ringing a large brass handbell, swinging it back and forth with his arm. It was time to go into class. It was the jolly man who was my teacher. At least I knew someone. So I climbed the stone steps. I stopped in front of him and greeted him with a "hello." I was pleased to see him. "Get into your class before I take my cane to you," he retorted angrily, waving a bamboo cane at me with his other hand. Not the greeting or guidance I expected on my first day in a strange new environment. I toddled past him, feeling quite confused and a little shocked. He turned round and shouted after me, "I am not your friend." I went into the class and was guided by some of the kinder kids to an empty desk. The teacher came in and everyone shut up and sat forward on their benches. He instructed everyone to put their hands on the desk in front of them, palms facing down. Starting at the other end of the class, the teacher walked between the rows of boys, cane waving eagerly. Then a loud crack as he whacked a kid across the fingers. "Stand up," he shouted. "What is your excuse for coming into my class with dirt in your fingernails? How dare you?" This kid was obviously from a poor background and had the demeanour of someone whose spirit was broken. He didn't make a lot of eye contact. He said that he had to do 2 hours farm chores from 6 to 8 a.m. before school each morning, and that was how his nails had dirt in them. He was told angrily that he was filthy and would cause the spread of disease. How dare he come to school in that state? He was to go out to the toilet. There was cold water and no soap in the toilet. and wash himself. He wasn't supposed to be a savage. If he was ever to come to school again with dirty fingernails, there would be hell to pay. He was to bring a letter of apology in the following morning from his parents for allowing him to come to school in that state. The kid explained that neither of his parents could read or write. It sounded like he would have difficulty asking them. The teacher said he didn't care. Under no circumstances was he to come in tomorrow without a letter of apology from them. They could employ a professional person, a doctor or a solicitor, to write the letter for them. The next morning he was scrutinized, presented the letter, and was told to sit down. There was a lot of rote learning. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. The cane banging out the letters, numbers and words, all sing-song and en masse. 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3, 3 and 1 is 4. Prayers. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, etc. I think I suppressed most memories of those formative years for much of my life. I always considered my childhood as happy. The next class, middle babies, was another abusive brother. He would quietly sneak behind you and flick your ear with his finger. With the sting came, "I hope you are paying attention." Every so often he would get the class to stand beside their desks, facing the blackboard. He went through the rows, each boy from behind, working his fingers, greedily trying to grip at some hair on the temples of each boy in turn. If he could grip any hair, he would yank it from your head, tell you to get your hair cut by tomorrow and sit down. There was always a few boys whom he managed to lift from the ground. He would smile, holding them up, until his audience began to share in his amusement. Then he would shake them till he removed the hairs by the roots and they landed back on their feet, he still holding his hands aloft. A shout of, "Get your hair cut!" and the kid would sit down with 2 hands to the sides of their head, trying to deal with the pain. The teacher, with a smile affixed, would rub his fingers, with arms aloft, to the amusement of most of the boys, as the torn hairs drifted to the floor. I was rather anxious about learning to read. The teacher had already started at the other end of the room, testing a few boys each day, every mistake or failure to perform as expected resulting in the cane. It swished like a whip, each failing punishable with pain. I had a degree of trepidation and anxiousness when this procedure began, as I knew it would eventually come to my turn, and at that stage I was not able to read. However, I woke up one morning and it all made sense. I could read. A lot of understanding happens for me that way. Thoughts, ideas, mechanisms, systems, programs. The brain works them out and presents me with the solutions. But that is by and by. Another day's topic. One day in class aged 5 or 6, I was daydreaming. I do that a lot. Some thought or idea starts to develop in my head, and the inward eye, as Wordsworth described it, takes prominence. Although nearly all prayers were rote learned, we were told to learn off a prayer called the Act of Contrition as our homework. I never heard the instruction. The following day, after lunch break, each kid was called to the front of the class to recite this prayer. Each kid who failed to recite it had to hold out his hand for 6 lashes of the cane with all the ferociousness that the brother could muster. The pain was excruciating. If you flinched, you got extra. My thumb is a little higher than my fingers, so that got the most. These canes were like a thin walking stick, about 8 millimeters in diameter, made from bamboo. With this brute, the cane did not stop on your hand. It was swung from behind his head and went all the way to the floor. There was about 10 of us who couldn't recite the prayer. We were put in an annex of the class, a storeroom for school books, with our catechisms, and given 10 minutes to learn it by heart. I desperately tried to read it, but my eyes were watering with the pain, and I struggled to see the words on the page. No matter how much I rubbed at my eyes and tried to focus, the print on the catechism was just a blur, plus the pain of these little fingers down to the bone was very distracting. Some of the other boys were in uncontrollable fits of sobbing every 10 minutes. For the rest of the day, we were brought out, the punishment repeated, as the brother got more and more frustrated and angry with us for not being able to recite the prayer. When I went home, I told my parents, but they didn't want to know. I should have been paying attention in class, and I should fight my own battles. Next class, aged 6 to 7, was a lay teacher who was nice. Shortly after starting that class, we moved to a different town, and back with a very odd brother again. I could go on with many more examples of this type of brutality and intimidation by people in authority, some very horrific. These creatures would pick on vulnerability and make an example of them for the rest of the class. Many kids were damaged by this, making them anxious and nervous later in life. One could say, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." People grow up, they have their own kids, and they realize how easily they can fall into the trap of responding to their kids as their parents responded to them. It is the time gap that makes this obvious to them. Most of the kids in the schooling system were severely damaged by these horrors, but were never aware of how their lives, reactions, and behavior was twisted by the disgusting behavior exhibited by their elders. Every so often on public radio here, someone would phone a talk show and talk about how they suffer from anxiety, which they put down to what happened to them as a kid in school under the hands of the religious. Straight away there would be another caller who says the first caller sounds like a baby who never grew up. They need to grow a pair of kahunas. This new caller, quite bombastic, and probably even a paid contributor. If it wasn't for the Christian Brothers, or whoever, I wouldn't be half the man I am today. The host, quite friendly towards the second caller, would ask them what they do. The typical response is, "I'm retired now, but I devoted my life to public service." If you are young, honest, have a sense of empathy towards others, feel you differ from the madding crowd, and expect you may someday end up as a self-employed sole trader, motivated by challenge and understanding as opposed to just money. You may have to sacrifice a degree of your time towards acquiring skills and knowledge to improve your professionalism. If you are young and just starting out, then get the fuck out of Ireland and find a country that doesn't employ damaged, abusive people en masse that shit on human rights. This country is so destructive, and the sad thing is that people's early conditioning has made them oblivious as to how abusive they can be, particularly after they have been blooded into organizations or institutions. While you are young, get out, or if you live, it will most likely be to regret that you didn't. The number of suicides in this country is not without cause and effect. This is getting heavy, but it needs to be said. As an afterthought, many sane people here know and speak of how fucked up this country is. Yet the longest-serving Prime Minister, while in office, told the begrudgers to go off and commit suicide. It did not harm his career, as he was playing to his audience.